Now, as you now know, aperture size is one of the three elements we use to determine exposure. But as I mentioned in a previous module, we also use the size of the aperture to control how much of our photograph is actually in focus. And we call this ratio depth of field. Now, as humans, we see the world in 3D. And when we focus on something relatively close to us, the background becomes out of focus or slightly blurred. Now, we call this a shallow depth of field. This isolates the subject and makes it the point of interest. Now, we can achieve the same effect with our camera by opening up the size of the aperture to make it bigger. Now, of course, we also like the images where everything is in focus. Now, to achieve this, we would close the aperture down to a smaller size. So, in this module, we'll take a look at aperture sizes and a guide to how to select the right size. And I'm also going to capture some photographs and then vary the aperture size. Then we will take a look at the results. Then at the very end, we'll take a look at a selection of photographs I have captured out and about with my camera by varying the aperture size. So let's jump in and take a look. So here is a selection of aperture sizes ranging from fully open to closed down really small. Each size is given a corresponding F number, with the largest aperture having the smallest number and the smallest aperture having the biggest number. Here we can see the largest aperture has an aperture size of f1.4 and the smallest aperture size has an f number of f32. Now, it is really important to remember this, that a big hole, a big aperture has a small number and a small hole has a big number. It's counterintuitive, I know, but once you get your head around it, it's quite easy to remember. Now, it is the larger aperture sizes that give us the shallow depth of field, the amount of blurry background, if you like. Now, used creatively, we can isolate a subject from the background, and this is ideal for portraits, product shots, etc. Now, middle aperture sizes are considered to be ideal for general photography. They have the least amount of lens distortion. And lastly, the small apertures give us the greatest depth of field. This means that more of the image will be in focus, and they are ideal for landscapes, cityscapes, group shots and interiors. So on this Lumix camera, we can see we've got an aperture range from f2.8 down to f22. And on this Canon camera, from 1.8 down to f22 again. Now, before I capture any photographs using this Lumix camera, here is a quick guide to what you should be looking at. You can see the current settings along the bottom of the frame. We have, starting from the left, the mode, which is shown that the camera is in manual mode, highlighted in pink. Next, we have the shutter speed highlighted in red. Then the aperture size highlighted in blue. Then the exposure meter highlighted in yellow, and lastly the ISO highlighted in green. So in this first example, I'm going to use a large aperture to blur the background, and I'm going to focus on this red car. So let's take a look at how I do that. So we can see I have a shutter speed of 250, an aperture size of f11, ISOs of 5000, and we can see in the exposure meter that we are underexposed by 1 2/3 of a stop. So first of all, let me change the size of the aperture to f2.8. So I've opened the aperture up nice and big, and we can now see we're overexposed by +2 1/3. So the first thing I'd do then is drop the ISO, and we can drop it all the way down to, in this case, down to 1000. And looking in the exposure meter, we have now got the perfect exposure because we can see it is now reached 0. However, the ISO could be dropped a little bit more. And to do that, I'm going to slow down the shutter speed to 125th of a second. And again, we're slightly overexposed, but that's exactly what I wanted because now I can drop the ISO down to 640. I've now got the perfect exposure. I can see it's on 0 in the exposure meter, and I can capture that photograph. And of course, I can move the focus point around, focus on the skull, and then focus on the camera at the back, the brownie camera, knowing that my exposure is going to be perfect in all of those 3 shots. So let's close the aperture size down smaller to f8 and see what results that we get this time. So first of all, I would close the aperture size down to f8. And as you can see, looking at the exposure meter, I'm minus 2 2/3 underexposed. So the first thing I would do then is drop the shutter speed down to a 60th of a second. Now we're still underexposed. And so I would lift the ISO up and all the time watching the exposure meter, looking for that magic 0. So at those settings, 60th of a second, f8, and with the ISO on ISO 2000, we get the perfect exposure. So let's carry on our journey then of closing the aperture size down and take a look what happens when we close it down to f16. So the first thing to do then is close the aperture size down to f16. When we do this, we can see in the exposure meter that we're now 2 stops underexposed. Now I'm going to leave the shutter speed on 60th of a second and lift the ISO up to 8000. And when I do that, I can see again our exposure meter is indicating 0, and I can indeed take that shot and I've got the perfect exposure. So lastly, let's close the aperture size down to f22 and see what results we get. So closing the aperture size down to f22, we can see we've got an exposure meter reading of -1. So the first thing I would do then is to lift the ISO higher. And indeed we get the perfect exposure. So now if we overlay the 4 photographs that I've captured at the different aperture sizes, we overlay them on top of each other, and we can see the difference as we close the aperture size down, and we'll see more things become in focus. Let's take a look. First at f2.8, where the background is a complete blur. Then closing down to f8, where the skull is beginning to be revealed. At f16, we get more detail in the skull, and the camera is now beginning to be revealed in the background. Then f22, all the items are more or less in focus. And then back to f2.8, and you can see the difference between f22 and f2.8 is amazing, isn't it? So as you can see, you can be super creative with aperture size, and you really can determine where the viewer is going to look just by putting the point of focus on the item or the person or the subject and selecting a big aperture size. Then the person looking at your photograph is going to look at what is in focus. It's a great way of sort of, if you like, telling a story with a photograph. Now, obviously I took those photographs using the manual setting, but let's take a look at how easy and how quick it is when you jump into the aperture priority mode, because as you know, in the aperture priority mode, the only thing you have to worry about is the aperture size. So let's take a look then at how quick and simple it is. So as you can see, we are currently underexposed. Now, in the manual mode, I would need to adjust all 3 elements to achieve the correct exposure. Now remember, in aperture priority, you only have to choose the aperture size. So to show you the magic of aperture priority and how the camera helps you achieve the perfect exposure, I will need to pop the lens cap on so you can see how quickly we can move from an underexposed photograph to a perfectly exposed photograph. So the first thing I'm going to do is change the ISO to automatic. Then I'll change the camera mode from manual to aperture priority, so A or AV on the mode wheel. Then I'm going to take off the lens cap and let's see what happens. Perfect exposure. Now ignore the plus or minus 0. That is not the exposure meter. That is the exposure compensation, but more on that later. So we now have the perfect exposure. Let's take a little look at the shutter speed, and if I half press the shutter release button, it's indicating that it's 1/125. Now I have actually set my camera in the menu to ensure it doesn't drop below 1/125. Because of course, obviously the camera is now selecting the shutter speed for me, and I don't want the camera to select a shutter speed that is much too slow. So in the menu, I have set it so when it does select the shutter speed for me, it doesn't drop below 1/125. Now, if you can do that in your camera, then please do. Just look for minimum shutter speed in your camera's menu. So if I half press the shutter release button, I can see the ISO that the camera has selected. And in this case, it's ISO 2500. Now I would like to make the aperture size bigger to give me a nice blurry background. So I'm going to select f2.8. And then when I half press the shutter release button, you can see because I'm letting more light in through the aperture size, the ISO has dropped now to 640. So the camera has selected 640 for me. And I've got the perfect exposure and the exact photograph that I wanted. Now I can go on to make further changes. F8. The ISO has now gone up to 5000 and I can capture that shot. And then I can simply again adjust the aperture size and make it smaller all the way to f16. ISO has now gone up to 12,800, but we can see the shutter speed has now dropped to a 60th. So as I said earlier, I've set a minimum shutter speed of 1/125, but I also set a maximum ISO of 12,800. So when the camera is working out what settings to use, it's made a note of the aperture size that I've selected, which is quite small. It is made a note also that it could not go above 12,800 because I set that as a maximum. So the only option left for the camera was to make the shutter speed drop below that 1/125. So you do have to keep an eye on the settings that the camera is selecting. And in most cases, it gets it perfect. And dropping to a 60th per second or below that in this case is fine. So finally, let's close the aperture size down to f22. Now remember, I have the ISO capped at a maximum of 12,800. So the camera has selected a shutter speed of a 30th of a second. Now remember, my minimum shutter speed was 1/125, 125th per second. But to achieve the perfect exposure, the camera has had to override my setting and select a shutter speed of a 30th of a second. So let's take a look at those 4 images together then, all shot with aperture priority. The first one, f2.8, and we can see that lovely shallow depth of field. Then the second one at f8, and we can see the skull is starting to become in focus. By the time we open up to f16, we can see a lot more detail in the skull and the camera is coming into focus. And then at f22, pretty much everything is in focus. So aperture priority is fantastic, isn't it? And it's so easy. And all you have to think about is creatively, what do you want to achieve? So now let's take a look at some photographs that I've taken over the years using aperture priority. So this first one, f5.6, and the focus is on the rope. It's great, isn't it? It just separates the subject from the background. Now this next one, I've used f3.5 and I've focused on the gentleman doing a limbo dance underneath the flame. Now I've used f3.5 to make the background blurred, but creatively, was that the right thing to do? Because we look in the next shot, taken at roughly the same time using a smaller aperture, we can see the people in the background are more in focus, and I think that looks more interesting. We can look at the people's reactions. Now there's no right or wrong, both photographs are fine. It's just a creative decision, and that's what we can do with aperture size. So this one, a street photograph I captured at f11, and as you can see, most things are in focus, which is exactly what you want for a street photograph. Now this shot was shot really close with a very large 1.8 aperture, and you can see that there's very little of that photograph that is in focus, but it is a really nice effect. This one at 2.8 kind of transports you into the photograph, and that's what I love about a shallow depth of field. f3.5, and this is a great character study. Another street photograph shot at f8. And the same again at f8. This one taken in Madrid at f11 to get most things in focus. And this one at F16 in Liverpool of the Palm House. And again, everything can focus 1.8 and getting close in. It's a really nice effect, isn't it? F3.5 in the Mersey Tunnel. And this one, F16 on Crosby Beach. So as you can see, you can be super creative just by adjusting the size of your aperture. So give it a go. Jump into Aperture Priority, or if you're feeling super adventurous, jump into fully manual, and I will catch up with you in the next module.